So our third snippet is going to look at the early Supreme Court and sort of judicial and extrajudicial authority. This is John Marshall, who serves as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for the first 3 decades of the 19th century. The court doesn't do a ton in the first 12 years of its operation. So Marshall, who was John Adams as Secretary of State. Remember, Adams is a Federalist. He's appointed Chief Justice just before Adams leaves office, and so the Jeffersonians are somewhat skeptical of his approach. Probably the decision for which Marshall is best known is this case Marbury versus Madison, and Marshall pressed the Supreme Court for unanimous decisions. He wanted the court to speak as one. This is a case, the specifics of which are are utterly bizarre. They dealt with whether Federalists who were appointed to federal jobs right at the end of the of the Adams administration had a right to, and then saw those jobs denied by the Jefferson administration through the actions of Secretary of State James Madison. And Marbury was one of these. He was one of he had federal position. He had a right to sue and have the courts order the Secretary of State to award these jobs. And this case presented Marshall with, it seemed like an awful situation. So on the one hand, he could uphold Marbury's lawsuit. But if he did that, that was certainly going to alienate the Jeffersonians, because he would seem to be ordering the federal government to install these Federalists into federal positions, even though the Federalists had lost the election of 1800. Or he could side with Madison and say, these people don't deserve a job. But the problem here is, many of these people, including Marbury, had actually been appointed through then Secretary of State Marshall, and so this was a problem. So instead, he comes up with an argument saying that the opinion comes up with an argument. He's the author of the opinion, saying that the provision of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which authorized Marbury to file suit in federal court under these circumstances, was invalid. That in fact it was unconstitutional. That the Congress did not have the authority to dictate to the federal courts how these suits would be handled. And the key point here is in red. This established the principle of judicial review as applicable to the Supreme Court. So Marbury is cited, hundreds and hundreds of times after this in American history as saying, when there's a debate over what the Constitution says, you don't go to state legislatures about this. You don't go to Congress. It is the courts who have the final word on these questions. So it's a path-breaking decision. Now, the Marshall Court is quite unpopular. That includes another Federalist appointee on the court, Samuel Chase, who is Marshall is a political operator. Chase somewhat less so, and he antagonizes the Jeffersonians in Congress. They see him as too partisan on the Supreme Court, and he becomes the second person impeached in American history. But largely, the sense is that his impeachment is caused by the fact that the new majority in Congress, the Jeffersonians, just don't like his ideas. They want to get rid of him so they can appoint someone of their own ilk into Congress, and there's a backlash against this in the Senate. So he's not convicted, and it establishes the principle that impeachment can occur for malfeasance or for criminal activity by a judicial officer, or in theory by an executive officer, but simple disagreement with policies is not an appropriate use of the impeachment power. Now, I said that Chase was the second person impeached. The first is this guy, William Blount, who we've heard a bit about in the last couple of weeks. He was relevant to the Trump impeachment proceedings. Blount was a member of the U.S. Senate from Tennessee, who was engaged in land speculation and kind of borderline seditious activity with the Spanish and British and the American Southwest Tennessee border with Mississippi and Alabama. And the Senate was just, it was not pleased with what Blount was doing. I mean, this was illegal behavior. They wanted to get rid of him, but it was not clear under the Constitution whether a senator could be expelled or whether the senator had to be impeached. So the Senate tries to do both. They pass a measure to expel him, but they also call and the House does impeach. And at that point, Blunt says, "Fine, I'm just, I'm gone. I'm not going to be impeached." But he's impeached anyway. So the Blunt affair seems to establish the precedent that a non-office holder can be impeached even if he has left office for impeachable behavior, high crimes and misdemeanors that took place while he was in office. But, and this is the critical but, the Blunt impeachment also is seen as evidence of an improper impeachment, that impeachment applies to the president, executive branch officials or judicial officials, but not to legislative officials. The House and the Senate can simply expel members that they believe have committed criminal conduct. So the Marshall Court issues a number of critical decisions over its 3-decade span. Marbury is obviously the most important, but a number of other path-breaking ones. One relates to the contract power. So this is Dartmouth College. This is an Ivy League school in New Hampshire. It's in northern New Hampshire, right on the border with Vermont. And Dartmouth College was chartered by the New Hampshire State Legislature. And when they chartered it, it was like, all right, this is a little school. It's in the middle of nowhere. But by the early 19th century, Dartmouth has become a quite prominent school. The legislature decides, well, maybe we'll reconsider our charter, try to get more money out of Dartmouth as a result of this. Maybe we will actually take control over the administration of Dartmouth, kind of convert it into a public institution. And the trustees of Dartmouth, and the New Hampshire legislature, in fact, passes a law to that effect. The trustees of Dartmouth sue in federal court, and their argument is that the charter, which is this piece of document under which the legislature authorized the creation of Dartmouth College, constituted a contract. And in a contract, they argued, you can revise the contract if both parties agree, but one party simply can't unilaterally rewrite the contract. And the result is this case called Dartmouth College versus Woodward, which is the first big breach of contract case in U.S. history. And the Marshall Court says that this charter is a contract, and the state legislature is violating the contract by changing the terms unilaterally. If they want to take control of Dartmouth College, they have to go to the trustees and say, let's negotiate this. And the trustees, of course, have no interest in this, and Dartmouth College remains to this day a private institution. Next big issue in the Marshall Court deals with federalism, the battle between state and federal authority. And it related to one of Hamilton's ventures, the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the U.S. was a very controversial body. It would tend to be quite unpopular in the South, very popular in the North. It lasts for 40 years, and then Andrew Jackson basically kills it during Jackson's presidency. But several state governments were, even during this earlier period, were trying to find ways to undermine the bank. And the state of Maryland came up with the idea of taxing this federal body, the Bank of the United States. And the goal was to impose really high taxes on it and basically to just sort of undermine its existence. So the bank sues. And the case is called McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. And the Supreme Court rules that the state of Maryland's tax scheme against this federal authority is a violation of the separation of powers principle, of federalism principle in the Constitution, that the states cannot intrude on federal principles. And this opinion has a very, very famous line from the Marshall Court: a right to tax without limit or control is essentially a power to destroy. This line will appear a lot in sort of conservative political rhetoric in the 20th century. In particular, it's making the argument: look, we need to restrain taxation powers, even just politically, because otherwise you create a too powerful federal government. So this is a really big decision. Similarly, the Marshall Court favors federal over state power. This is a recurring theme in martial court rulings with regards to the transformation of the American economy. This is a steamboat. Robert Fulton, the guy who invents it, in the 1820s, and this revolutionizes sea travel within the United States. The state of New York and other states try this as well, pass a law to impose taxes on steamships that are traveling through their states. Basically, it would be the equivalent now if you had if you had a factory in New York City and you wanted to sell your goods in Pennsylvania, you'd have to pay a tax to cross the boundary into Pennsylvania. And the Supreme Court in Gibbons versus Ogden in 1828 says no, that the power to regulate commerce is in the national government. Congress has that power. State governments cannot, can't do this on their own. So this is a kind of robust vision of federal power. And each of these decisions are implemented and sort of establish this principle of a more robust federal system, which of course fits with the federalist political philosophy of Marshall. Then there's the big one that doesn't, right at the end of his term. So here's a contemporaneous map of the state of Georgia. You see all of these counties here in Georgia, DeKalb and Gwinnett County. Those of you who followed the presidential elections, these were counties that swung heavily towards Biden in 2020. But here in northwestern Georgia, you see Cherokee Indians. And this was a reservation that was created. The Indians sort of lost the wars against the United States, and so they're confined to a certain amount of land. But technically, they're sovereign in this territory. The state of Georgia passes a law which allows for the sale of property in the Cherokee territory to Georgia citizens, regardless of what the Cherokee government wants to do. And the goal here is to allow white speculators to take over Cherokee land. So the Cherokees sue in federal court, and the case works its way up to the Supreme Court in a decision called Worcester versus Georgia. And in that opinion, the Marshall courts, the last big opinion of Marshall, says the Cherokee Nation has its own territories, and in this section, the laws of Georgia have no force. And so technically what the Supreme Court is saying, well, not technically, the Supreme Court is saying here that these Georgia laws are invalid and therefore the Cherokee laws are valid and all of these land sales are gone. Andrew Jackson's response to this is, I'm not going to enforce the ruling. State of Georgia makes clear it's not going to enforce the ruling. The result is one of these shameful episodes in American history, the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee are basically kicked out of Georgia. They're forcibly resettled into Oklahoma, and the land is seized. The Cherokee case is a reminder that the Supreme Court's authority, at the end of the day, is a kind of moral authority, and a president's intent on defying the Supreme Court, if he has support in Congress and among the public, which Jackson did, has the ability to do this. So this kind of harkens us back to our discussion in the groups last week. This would be an example of the courts as the least dangerous branch, because at the end of the day, in this confrontation between the court and the executive, it's Jackson who prevails and Marshall who doesn't. So that's a quickie summary of the Marshall Court and the key decisions in this 3-decade period.